Long-distance driving wasn't my strong suit. I preferred short, familiar routes where I could coast on autopilot. But when my boss called me into the main office in San Francisco, I had no choice but to make the 10-hour drive from my small hometown of Broly. It wasn't even along the scenic California coastal highway, but through the desolate stretches of desert and tiny forgotten towns on the state's opposite edge. I wasn't thrilled. I set out at 6 p.m., hoping to reach my hotel by 3 p.m. the next day. The first hour was fine, passing familiar places, gradually giving way to open spaces and the occasional lonely building. As the miles ticked by, the road became eerily empty. No other cars, just the seemingly endless stretch of highway and the encroaching darkness. 3 hours in, I saw a flicker of lights, a gas station. I glanced at my fuel gauge and felt my heart sink. I'd barely noticed how low it was getting. I'd been zoned out, lulled by the monotony of the drive, and now the needle hovered dangerously close to empty. I kept going, hoping to find another station soon, but the road remained barren. Panic set in as the car began to sputter. I couldn't believe I'd let myself get into this situation. In the middle of nowhere, with no gas, no cell service, and no idea where the next town might be. Then, just as my car threatened to die completely, I spotted headlights on the side of the road ahead. A parked car. I squinted at it as I approached, and it looked like a police car. Relief washed over me. Maybe they had a gas canister, or could at least help me figure out what to do. I pulled over, parking a little way behind the car, and got out, walking toward it. As I neared, something felt off. It had the right look. A spotlight, a light bar on the roof. But there were no police markings. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that this wasn't an active patrol car. It was an old, retired police vehicle, still in decent shape, but clearly not in service anymore. I peered into the window. The car was empty, but not abandoned. The interior was neat, with a grocery bag on the passenger seat filled with snacks and drinks. My skin prickled with unease. Where was the driver? The sense of something being wrong gnawed at me, and I instinctively glanced around. That's when I saw it, a figure moving out in the desert, barely visible in the dim light. They were far off, just a shadow against the endless night, but it was unmistakably a person. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of it. Were they the owner of the car? What were they doing out there? My gut told me to leave, to get back to my car and lock the doors, but I hesitated. And then the figure stopped moving. They turned toward the road, and I realized they were looking at me. A wave of dread washed over me as the person started to sprint, full tilt, toward the road. Panic surged through me. I spun on my heel and ran back to my car, fumbling with my keys in my pocket. By the time I reached the door, the man was nearly at the road. I jumped inside, slamming the door shut, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. I glanced up and saw him standing by his car, staring at me, his face illuminated by my headlights. He was covered in dirt, his clothes and face caked with sand. He looked disheveled, like he'd been out in the desert for hours, maybe days. He didn't move, just stood there, eyes locked on mine. My fingers trembled as I repeatedly tried to call 911, but the signal kept dropping. The man didn't budge, just stood like a predator waiting for its prey to make the next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got through to an operator. I was almost crying with relief, explaining my situation in a rush of words. I glanced up again, and the man was gone. His car was pulling away, lights off, silently disappearing into the darkness. I stayed in my car, too terrified to move, until a police officer finally arrived, pouring a few gallons of gas into my tank. I told him everything, about the man, the car, the bizarre behavior, but he didn't seem concerned. He brushed it off, cracking a joke about the guy burying a body out there, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Shaken and unnerved, I didn't argue. I just thanked him and drove off, counting down the miles until I was back in civilization. But the whole drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed, I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't seen him in time. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never drive that stretch of road again. It was a typical Friday night, and I was relieved to be done with work for the week. My commute home was usually a straightforward drive through the quiet suburbs, just 30 minutes away from the city. But this night was different. As I drove along the dimly lit road, the comforting silence was interrupted by a pair of headlights that appeared unusually bright in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another vehicle heading my way. But as the car approached, the light grew blindingly intense. I squinted and tried to keep my lane, but as the car came closer, it became clear. It was on the wrong side of the road. My heart raced as I swerved to avoid a collision. The sudden jolt threw me into the ditch beside the road, and my car came to a violent halt. Dazed but mostly unharmed, I scrambled out of the car. It was in ruins, front end smashed beyond recognition. I quickly glanced up the road, expecting to see the headlights fading away. But instead, I saw the car had stopped a short distance ahead. They weren't leaving. My pulse quickened as I realized how isolated I was. I dashed back to my wrecked vehicle and grabbed my phone, dialing 911. The operator assured me that help was on the way within minutes. I hung up and turned to head back to the road when I froze. A figure stood at the top of the ditch, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't speak or acknowledge my presence. My stomach dropped as the headlights of the car grew brighter, heading straight toward the ditch. It was the same vehicle, now backed up almost to the edge. Another man emerged from the driver's seat and joined the first. They spoke in a harsh, guttural language I couldn't recognize, perhaps Russian or German. It was the kind of language that made my skin crawl. One of the men hurried to the trunk of their car, throwing it open. But instead of retrieving something, he and the other man turned and charged toward me. Instinct took over. I bolted into the woods, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The men were fast, but they were heavier and not built for endurance. I managed to gain some distance, darting through the dark forest. The woods were pitch black, and every sound seemed amplified. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to keep moving. The men's shouts and footsteps grew fainter behind me. I focused on the distant sound of sirens, hoping to find my way back to the road. After a nerve-wracking few minutes, I stumbled out of the trees and onto the road, where the flashing lights of the police car pierced through the night. The officers were inspecting my car and looked up as I emerged from the darkness. I rushed to them, breathless and disheveled, recounting the ordeal. They took down my statement, but with no clear evidence of the men's intentions and only a vague description, their investigation was limited. The men vanished without a trace. They hadn't stolen anything from my car, but it was clear they had an agenda. Whether they had planned to abduct me before the crash or improvised afterward, I couldn't be sure. What was evident was that they had been waiting for an opportunity, and I had narrowly escaped becoming their next victim. The terror of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly a normal evening can spiral into something nightmarish. It was a chilly Friday evening, and the small downtown cafe was about to close. The staff had just finished their shift and were preparing to lock up. Jack, one of the waiters, was in charge of closing up for the night. It was usually a quick and routine process, but tonight, something felt off. Jack had a gut feeling that the night was different. With the cafe closing early for the weekend, he decided to stick around and make sure everything was in order. His coworker, Sarah, was more than happy to leave early, so Jack told her she could go while he waited for the cleaning crew. The cleaning crew, a regular fixture at the cafe, always arrived promptly around 7 p.m. Jack was familiar with their van and their faces, a grizzled old man and two younger men. But as the clock struck 6:30, Jack noticed an unfamiliar van pulling up outside. The vehicle was plain and unmarked, its windows tinted dark. His heart sank as he saw 3 men getting out. Jack's curiosity turned to unease when he realized he didn't recognize any of them. They wore dark blue uniforms, similar to the regular crew, but their demeanor was completely different. The men appeared disoriented, almost as if they were lost. One of them, an older man, shuffled around to the back of the van and opened the doors. Jack's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. The back of the van was empty. No cleaning equipment, no mops or buckets, just an eerie, cavernous space. The absence of gear was unsettling, but what truly frightened Jack was the men's reaction when he approached them. "Hey, are you guys new?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual despite the rising fear in his voice. The men looked at him with vacant expressions, as if they didn't understand his words. The older man muttered something unintelligible, his eyes flickering with a strange intensity. Jack took a step back, trying to appear nonchalant while his heart raced. "I think I need to call the manager," he said, pulling out his phone. The men didn't move or react, but their eyes followed his every movement with unnerving focus. As Jack dialed the manager's number, the man who had been at the back of the van slowly began walking towards him. Jack's breath quickened. He could feel the tension in the air. He could sense that something was horribly wrong. The man's movements were deliberate, almost predatory. Jack fumbled with his phone, desperately trying to convey the urgency of the situation. The manager answered, and Jack quickly explained the situation. "They're not from the cleaning company. They don't have any cleaning supplies, and one of them is coming towards me." "Stay where you are," the manager instructed firmly. "I'll be right there." Jack's mind raced as he glanced back at the men. The one walking towards him stopped abruptly and turned back to the van, speaking in a low, guttural tone to the others. The men exchanged glances before climbing back into the van. The vehicle roared to life, and with a screech of tires, they sped off into the night. Jack stood frozen for a moment, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He watched the van disappear around the corner, then hurriedly locked up the cafe and drove to a nearby parking lot to wait for the manager. The manager arrived within minutes, his face grim. He listened intently as Jack described the men and their van. He immediately contacted the cleaning company and was informed that no one had been dispatched yet. The company promised to send the regular crew as soon as possible. Despite the manager's assurances, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The real cleaning crew arrived a short while later, and they too were puzzled by the description of the men. The manager reported the incident to the police, but no trace of the mysterious van or its occupants was ever found. The cafe returned to its usual routine, but the memory of that night lingered. Jack often found himself glancing nervously at the van that pulled up every evening, wary of the shadows lurking in the dark. The unsettling encounter remained a chilling reminder that sometimes the ordinary can turn terrifying in the blink of an eye.